Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Conversational AI with Rasa series. In this video, we will talk about slots. Slots are one of the most powerful features in Rasa that enables your assistant to collect important pieces of information and use them in a specific context. In simple words, slots are your assistant's memory. So for example, a detail like user's destination is a very important detail for a flight booking assistant. So just like we have in this example where the user says that they would like to book a flight ticket to Sydney, a detail called Sydney could be extracted as a slot and later on used by your assistant when making a booking. So how are the slots defined? You have to define your slots in a domain.yaml file of your assistant and provide the following information. You have to provide the slot name, the slot type, and additional configurations. We will cover slot types and additional configurations later on in this episode. To make everything easier to understand, I would like to give you a very quick look at the actual Rasa project. Here I have a very small example. It's a moodbot, but a little bit enhanced version of this project. As I have mentioned, slots should be defined in your domain.yaml file. Inside of this file, you will have to create a new section called slots and define all of the slots you would like your assistant to fill in this section. And as I have mentioned, the details that you have to provide for slots are the slot name, the slot type, and it's optional, but you can provide additional configurations. There are two ways of how slots can be set using Rasa. One of them is using NLU, and this is where slots can be connected to entities. If you have an entity that is named exactly the same way as one of your slots, the value of that specific entity can be used to automatically fill in that specific slot. There are specific additional configurations that you can add to modify this behavior, but this is a very simple way to fill in slots using NLU models. To make everything easier to understand, I would like to go back to my actual Rasa assistant to show you how things work in practice. Inside of my domain.yaml file, you will see that I have an entity called destination. You will also notice that I have a slot called exactly the same way, destination. This entity destination is extracted using NLU model, and I have some training data for that. So if I go back to my NLU.yaml file, you will see that I have a few examples where assistant learns to extract an entity destination. Now, when my assistant extracts this detail, the value of the entity destination will automatically be used to fill in the slot destination, just because the name of the entity matches the slot name and we don't have any additional configurations that would alter this behavior. The second way to set slots with Rasa is using custom actions. We will cover that later on in the series. It's a big topic, so we would like to dedicate an actual episode to that. But just to give you a brief understanding of how this works. In some cases, you would like your assistant to connect to the database and extract some details or make an API call and get some details like that. Those details can be set as slots and used later on in the conversation in a specific context. You can achieve that using custom actions, but as I said, we will cover that a little bit later in the series. As I have mentioned, when defining slots, there are some additional configurations that you can add to specify the behavior of your slots a little bit more. I would like to cover one of them right now. It's a flag called autofill. It's a very powerful feature that enables you to alter the behavior of automatic slot filling for the slots that have matching entities. If you remember the example that I just gave you about the entity values being used to fill in the slots for the slots that match the values of the entities, you can alter that behavior using the autofill flag. In the situations where you don't want slots to be filled in with matching entity values, you can disable this behavior by setting autofill flag to false. The default configuration is true. In addition to just storing the pieces of information, slots can be used to influence the flow of the conversation. It's an extremely important and powerful feature of slots in Rasa. You can define this behavior by configuring the flag influence conversation in your slot configuration. The way slots influence the conversation highly depends on the type of the slot, and we will talk about those details a little bit later in this episode. In some situations, you would like your assistant to drive the conversation in a specific way, depending on whether or not specific detail has been provided, or depending on the value of that specific detail. Let me give you a very simple and quick example of that. We have a user that would like to book a ticket to New York. If an assistant gets the detail of the destination, in this case New York, with the initial message of the user, an assistant can go ahead and check for the available flights. In an alternative situation where the user starts the conversation with saying, "Hi, I would like to book a flight ticket," an assistant will need to ask for the destination to be able to proceed and find an applicable option. This is just a very simple example of how your assistant can drive the conversation differently depending on the presence of a specific detail. In those kind of situations, you should consider configuring your slots to influence the flow of the conversation. However, remember to be mindful of when you configure specific slots to influence the flow of the conversation. A general rule of thumb that you should use is to configure your slots to not influence the conversation flow if you don't have a specific valid reason of why a specific slot should have an influence on how a dialogue management model makes predictions. And here I have another quick example of how the situation of where the slot should not influence the flow of the conversation can be configured and where it should be used. Again, we have a flight booking assistant, and in this case, assistant is able to extract one additional detail from the user inputs. It's the username. So in this example, we have a user Anna, and she says, "Hi, I would like to book a ticket to New York." This detail, name, is not very crucial for our assistant in this very specific case, and that's why assistant responds with, "Hi, which date would you like to travel?" In a different situation where the user doesn't provide their name and simply asks for a flight ticket, just because this slot would be configured to not influence the conversation, an assistant would respond exactly the same way. If you have some slots that are configured to influence the flow of the conversation, you will have to include them in your training stories in order to teach your assistant to respond in a specific way depending on whether or not specific detail has been provided or depending on the value of the slot, and that depends on the type of the slot that we will talk very soon. To illustrate that, I would like to go back to my Rasa example project. And we will talk about exactly the same example. We have the destination entity, we have the destination slot, and as you can see, the slot is configured to influence the conversation. To teach my assistant to respond in a specific way, depending whether or not this specific detail is provided, I will have to include some training stories to teach my assistant specific behaviors. So if I go to my stories.yaml file, here I will find two stories. One of them represents the situation where the user provides their destination. So as you can see, the user starts the conversation with a greeting, and then later on they ask for a flight ticket. And since the user provides the destination with this input, and the destination is London, I have to include slot was set step in my stories and provide the name of the slot with the actual value to teach my assistant that at this specific point, the user provided their destination, that the slot was set, and that an assistant now should proceed with looking for the options. In an alternative scenario where the user didn't provide their destination with their input, I would like to teach my assistant a little bit different behavior to ask what is the user's destination. In this case, when the user doesn't provide their destination and the slot was not set, an assistant will proceed to drive the conversation with a different response, asking for the destination. Again, I hope that this example illustrates a little bit better of how slots that can influence the conversation should be used to train your assistant to respond and drive the conversations in a more natural way. As I have mentioned probably quite a few times now, the way slots can influence the conversation highly depends on the type of the slot. And this is what I would like to talk about now. There are quite a few slot types at Rasa, and which slot type to use highly depends on the type of detail that you would like your assistant to store and use. I would like to go through all the slot types available in Rasa open source and explain a little bit more of how they work and in what situations they are the best to use. And I would like to start with a text slot. Text slot can be used to store any text values. The slot can be configured to influence the conversation using the influence conversation flag. A very important note here is that the actual value of the slot will have no influence on how the conversation goes. For text slots, only the presence or the absence of a specific detail will have influence on how the conversation goes if the slot is configured to influence the conversation. The general setup for text slots is very simple. You have to define them in your domain file and train your NLU model to extract entities if you would like entity values to be used to fill in this type of slot. The best example of the usage of text slot is the one that we have just discussed, the flight booking assistant. So if the user provides their destination when requesting the flight ticket to be booked, and this detail is extracted and set as a slot, an assistant can use the detail and go ahead and look for applicable options. In a different situation where the user didn't provide the detail, an assistant should probably respond with, "What is your destination?" Next slot type that is available in Rasa is a boolean slot. This slot is the best to store the information that can get two values, true or false. The slot can also be configured to influence the conversation depending on whether or not this is necessary. A very simple example that I have to illustrate of how boolean slot works is when the user provides their user ID, an assistant in the background can check if the user is authenticated to access specific information. And if the user is, then an assistant can proceed in responding and performing specific actions. If the user is not authenticated, an assistant will probably respond with something else, asking to provide additional details or telling the user that they are not authenticated and that there are another necessary steps needed for the user to take. As you can see, the definition and configuration of the slot type boolean is very similar to the previously covered text slot, but there is a very big difference in how these slots work. For boolean slot, it's actually the value that will influence the conversation if the slot is configured that way. Moving on, the next slot type available in Rasa is a categorical slot. Categorical slot is perfect to store the values that can get one of possible n values. This slot can also influence the conversation, and here again the value of the slot will be the important piece that will influence how the conversation goes. A very simple example of how the slot can be used is a restaurant booking assistant. The user would like to get a table in a restaurant that is within the medium price range. Assistant extracts the detail as a slot and uses that to make the search a little bit more specific. Slot type float can be used to store any numerical values. This slot type can also influence the conversation, and here again the value of the slot will be an important piece that will influence how the conversation goes. As you can see, you can define the minimum and the maximum value that the provided slot can obtain. If the user provides a value for the slot that is lower than the defined minimum value, that value will be set to the minimum value, and the same for the maximum. A very simple example of the usage of the slot is the restaurant booking assistant. Here the user would like to find a restaurant within the 10 miles radius. If assistant extracts this detail and stores this detail as a slot, then an assistant can use the detail later on to optimize the search. Another slot type that is available in Rasa open source is list slot. This slot is quite interesting because it allows you to store lists of values. The slot can also be configured to influence the flow of the conversation, And the way it works is quite similar to the previously discussed text slot. For list slots, the value of the slot will have no influence on how the conversation goes. It's the presence or the absence of the provided detail what matters. Another important detail is that the length of the list will have no influence on how the conversation goes, meaning that it doesn't matter how many values your assistant stored in the list. A very simple example of the usage of list slot is an assistant that allows the user to buy groceries. So when the user says that they would like to buy chocolate, milk, and cookies, an assistant will extract details like chocolate, milk, and cookies as entities under the same name items. If you have a slot that is configured as a list slot, your assistant will be able to extract all of these details under that specific slot. And then your assistant can use those details to add them to the shopping list. I would like to illustrate things a little bit more here and have a look at the actual example. As you can see, I have a slot called items in my slots list, and it has the type list. I also have entity called items, and I have some training data that allows my assistant to extract items from user inputs. Let's have a look at them. If I go back to my nlu.yaml file, you will see that I have an intent called buy groceries. And here the user provides how they would ask for an assistant to add specific groceries to the shopping list. So for example, they could say, I would like to buy milk, cookies, and chocolate. I would like to add flour and eggs to my shopping list, and similar. When assistant extracts these details using the NLU model, all of them will be extracted as an entity called items. And just because we have a slot that is called the same name and it has a type list, all of these details will be extracted as one list under the slot called items. I would like to show you how things work in practice by having a very quick conversation with my assistant. I will do that in a Rasa interactive environment. When my assistant is loaded, I will have a very quick conversation. So I will start with simple hello. And my assistant classified this intent as greeting, which is correct, and would like to respond with utterance greeting, which is also correct. And now my assistant wants to listen for my next input. So I will say, I would like to buy cookies and milk. My assistant classified this input as buy groceries intent and extracted corresponding entities, cookies and milk. So that sounds correct. And now, the thing that I would like you to pay attention is that you can see that my assistant did set a slot items, and this slot now has a list, cookies and milk, just because this is how the slot has been configured. Your assistant can later on use those details for specific responses, specific actions, and so on. It really depends on how you develop your assistant. And the last slot type that I would like to cover today is a slot type any. This slot can be used to store any arbitrary values that you would like your assistant to keep in the memory and use in a specific context. A very important piece about slot type any is that this slot will never have any influence on how the conversation goes, which means that this slot is the best to simply store the values that you would like your assistant to have the access to. An additional configuration that I wanted to cover is a configuration called initial value. With the initial value parameter, you can define a specific initial value that would be assigned to your slot at the beginning of the conversation. This value will stay assigned to your slot until the value of the slot is being reset by NLU or custom actions. The slots stay set until the end of the conversation or until they are reset by the NLU or your custom actions. The values themselves can be used in a specific context and are also available to be used in assistance responses and custom actions. We will cover all that in the later episodes of the Conversational AI with Rasa series, so I hope I'll see you there.